Tilly and Ray were Maisie's friends for over a decade and enjoyed each other's company, so going to pubs and days out were no stranger to them. They also enjoyed a lot of the same interests, such as the unexplained and paranormal, and indeed, Tilly and Ray had once lived in a very haunted house in North London. At one point, Tilly had been lifted off of her feet by something in her hallway, and a friend of theirs who'd stayed there had reported having seen someone they described as looking like the fried chicken man, the Colonel himself, walk straight through the wall of their living room. In fact, all manner of strange things had occurred there on different occasions. However, they were old hippies, so who knows if it really happened or if they were just high. Anyway, they opted to move house for the sake of theirs and their children's sanity. They had 2 young boys at the time, who as they grew older, loved to listen to all of the ghostly stories that their mum and dad would tell them. A sunny Sunday in late August seemed like a good time to kick back and enjoy a bit of a pub crawl for the 3 amigos Maisie, Tilly and Ray. After all, it was a bank holiday weekend, meaning no work on Monday. Hampstead was a stone's throw away from where they lived and was caked in history, so they set off to enjoy the day wandering. They made their way to a pub called the Gateway in nearby Highgate to start with. A very large, handsome pub, said to date back to the 13th century. There are tales of poltergeist activity in the theatre room above the bar, where chairs are reported to fling themselves from one end to another or pile up on the tables. And in the bar area, one barmaid had told of a strange feeling of being strangled while working the afternoon shift. Also, it's said that a man in Jacobean clothing haunts the stairs. They enjoyed a refreshing beer or 2 and bar snacks, and talked about the strange occurrences that went on in there. "Well, time to move on," Ray said. "Fancy the Spaniards Inn, guys?" The Spaniards Inn in Hampstead has a rich history that dates back to 1585, when 2 Spanish brothers built it. The Grade 2 listed pub is said to have inspired Charles Dickens and John Keats, and is now considered a living museum, with its walls of paintings telling stories of highwaymen, literary figures, and mythical creatures. Gazing up at the paintings, you could almost hear the sound of the horses' hooves racing past, carrying the dandy highwaymen. It got quite busy, with tourists gathering to soak up the history, so they were lucky to grab a table to themselves. After their fill of lunch, the 3 decided to move on. Tilly wanted to go to the Magdala Tavern, only 5 minutes away by car, so they grabbed a taxi. The Magdala Tavern became infamous after April the 10th, 1955, when Ruth Ellis shot and killed her lover, David Blakely, an up-and-coming racing driver, as an act of revenge for being unfaithful and beating her on numerous occasions. Ruth Ellis was convicted of murder and became the last woman in Britain to be hanged on July the 13th, 1955. 2 bullet holes remain in the wall outside the tavern to this day. As the afternoon drew to a close, the 3 friends decided on one more stop before home. Highgate Cemetery. Not everyone's cup of tea, but exploring a famous historic cemetery, famous because of who's buried there, was quite exciting for them. The cemetery was established in 1839 and covers 37 acres of land. The Victorian attitude to death and its presentation led to the creation of a wealth of Gothic tombs and buildings, all suitably scary to look at, adding to the attraction of the place. One of the most famous residents is Karl Marx, His tomb is huge and consists of a very large bust of Marx in bronze, set on a marble pedestal. In fact, there are many amazing graves with sculptures on them, like full-sized lions, horses, and one with a full-sized mastiff dog lying across his master's grave. So there they were, just wandering around the cemetery, looking at the tombs and gravestones, and happily chatting amongst themselves. As they passed one of the Gothic chapel entrances, Tilly spotted someone dressed in black disappear into the entrance and pointed this out to the others. They looked around, but no one was there. Tilly put it down to being half drunk and her imagination, so they carried on. But as they walked further, Tilly and Ray were giggling together over something. But Maisie had an uneasy feeling of being followed and kept turning around quickly, in hopes of catching a glimpse of someone or something. Maisie was stunningly beautiful, tall and slim with waist-length strawberry blonde hair which glistened in the sun, and icy blue eyes. Her bohemian-style clothing reflected the way she liked to feel, free and floaty. Tilly asked her what was wrong. Ray joked and said, "She's okay, just a tad tipsy like us. Isn't that right, princess?" Ray often used the term princess when talking to Tilly and Maisie as a term of endearment to them. "I feel a bit uneasy, like we're being followed," Maisie replied. Tilly said, "No, I don't think so. I think you and I are both picking up spiritual vibes. I feel it too." Tilly had always sworn she was psychic to a degree. It was nearing the time when the cemetery would be closing now, so they thought they should head in the direction of the main gates, which were about half an hour away. They'd covered a lot of ground whilst walking, chatting, and stopping to admire the magnificent Gothic headstones. As they walked past one of the mausoleums, Maisie spotted someone dart behind them. "Hello?" she called out. Tilly and Ray didn't see them, and asked her if she saw someone. "Yes, definitely," she replied. So Ray ran around to the other side and to the back, but couldn't see anyone. "Let's just go," he said. Tilly teased him and asked if he was scared. "No, of course not," he said. "But Maisie is, aren't you, Maisie?" "More curious, I'd say," she replied, and laughed. They carried on. The birds were beginning to sing their evening chorus, and the wind whistled through the trees as the late afternoon beckoned to the evening's dusk. As the trio rounded a bend in the gravelly pathway, they passed by a moss-covered crumbling mausoleum. From nowhere, there in front of them, was a tall man dressed completely in black, with a cape around him held together with a decorative gold pin. His face appeared ashen but starkly handsome, and his black hair was brushed back, forming a widow's peak. The three friends stopped dead in their tracks, and Maisie let out a screech, while Tilly grabbed on to Ray. "Wow," said Ray, addressing the man. "You scared the life out of us." The tall man looked straight past Ray and Tilly, and made a beeline towards Maisie. She jumped back as he held out his hand towards her and said, "There you are, you beautiful creature. Where have you been? I've waited all my lives for you." Maisie stared in amazement, frozen to the spot. Her mouth gaped open, and her eyes widened as if she'd been hypnotized. With that, Ray grabbed Maisie by the arm and thrust her forward in front of him, with Tilly. He then turned to the stranger to warn him off. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he disappeared into nowhere. Did he just say he'd waited for you all his lives, as opposed to all his life? What an idiot. Maisie fell into the arms of Tilly, shaking, and said, "What? Who was that?" "I don't know," Tilly replied. "Just some idiot playing games, thinking he could scare people." Ray was still looking back and wondering where the hell he'd vanished to. The three quickened their pace and very shortly neared the cemetery gates as the last bell was tolling, signalling the closure of the cemetery for the night. They said goodnight to the gatekeeper and mentioned having met with a strange person. "Oh, I'm sorry for that," the gatekeeper replied as he rattled his keys and looked at his watch in anticipation of locking up for the night. The friends sat on a bench placed just along the road leading up to the cemetery. They had a good view of the gates and were waiting to see the stranger come out before the gatekeeper locked up. A few people came through the gates, and then no one. Absolutely nothing. As the bell tolled for the last time, the gatekeeper locked up, put on his coat, and left. He passed the three on the bench and uttered goodnight to them as he opened the door to his car parked opposite the bench. "Bloody weirdo didn't come out then, eh?" Ray said to the girls. They just shrugged and got up from the bench and walked towards the main road, all in silence. "Come on," said Tilly. "Let's go in the shop and get some wine. We'll go home and relax. The boys are on a camping trip with their friends this weekend." "We've certainly had a busy day," Ray replied. But Maisie remained silent, which was most unlike her usually bubbly self. Tilly cuddled Maisie and asked, "You all right, chick?" It was clear that she was disturbed by this encounter. They arrived at Tilly and Ray's and went into the kitchen. Tilly put some music on while Ray proceeded to open the first bottle of red. He poured Maisie a generous glass and handed it to her, saying, "There you go, princess, get that down your neck," and hugged her shoulders. Maisie gave a big grin and finally broke her silence. "Do you think he was a vampire? Like a real one?" Tilly, half giggling, replied, "Well, he really did look like one, and who knows, they may walk among us." She downed her glass of red and poured herself another, offering the bottle to Ray and Maisie. Maisie had gotten quite warm and decided to take off her multicoloured crochet cardigan when she noticed a piece of paper in the pocket. She took it out. It was handwritten with ink and had a red crest stamped across the writing. It read, "I shall await your call." Below it, there was a phone number. "Oh my God, look guys," she exclaimed. Maisie's hair stood up on the back of her neck. "I never felt anyone put this in my pocket." "What is it?" asked Ray, and took it from her hand. "Oh," he said, and took a sip of his wine. "Would you look at that? A note from an ancient vampire. And he has a mobile phone. What a dork this guy is," and laughed out loud. Tilly and Maisie had to agree, and also laughed. "I'm just being silly, aren't I, worrying about this," said Maisie. "Hey," Tilly replied, "stop thinking about it." She took the paper, screwed it up, and then threw it in the bin. "I've filed it under B for bin, Maisie darling." She opened the next bottle of red, turned the volume up on the Bluetooth speaker, and started dancing around the kitchen to the 70s disco music that was playing. Maisie giggled and joined in. At this rate, I'll need to go out and get more wine, Ray said as he downed his fourth glass. Feel free, Tilly replied. After all, there's no work tomorrow and we can lie in bed all morning. You must stay the night, Maisie. Maisie agreed, and they carried on dancing, barefoot and fancy-free. Ray went to the shops in the high road, which was only 5 minutes away from their house, and returned with 2 more bottles of wine and a pizza from the local pizza shop. Let the party commence, he said, as he sat the pizza and wine on the kitchen counter. The wine flowed freely, and even Ray had joined the dancing. Well, his version of dancing, which was what the boys called dad dancing. As the last drop of wine had been consumed, Maisie went into the living room and flopped down on the sofa as she'd become rather dizzy. Before she knew it, she'd fallen asleep. Tilly and Ray decided to call it a night. Tilly covered Maisie over with a blanket and headed upstairs with Ray. They fell into bed, exhausted and drunk. Maisie awoke to the sun shining directly onto her through the living room window. She pulled the blanket over her eyes and let out a groan. She got up and headed to the bathroom. As she washed her hands, she looked into the mirror and thought, "What a mess," and laughed to herself. She went into the kitchen to get a glass of water in an attempt to soothe her aching head, but then remembered the note she'd found in her pocket. She remembered Tilly throwing it away and saw it crumpled in the bin. She bent down to pick it up and put it into her purse. She crept to Tilly and Ray's bedroom and peeped in. They were still sound asleep, so Maisie got her stuff together and left to go home, closing the street door quietly so as not to disturb them. When she got home, she ran a bath and made herself some tea and toast in a bid to stop the sickly feeling from all the wine she'd consumed the night before. As she lay in the bath, she thought about the weirdo in the cemetery. She wondered if he did that all the time, and why he hadn't come out when the cemetery closed. She thought about calling the number on the piece of paper, just to satisfy her curiosity. Just then, her phone rang and startled her out of her thoughts. She stood up and got out of the bath, wrapped her towel around her, and grabbed the phone. It stopped ringing before she could answer. To her relief, she saw it was Tilly, so she called back. "Sorry, Tilly, I was in the bath." "That's okay," Tilly replied. "I just wanted to know you were okay and why you left so early." "We're just cooking a fried breakfast, the perfect hangover cure, if you'd like to join us." Maisie was silent for a few seconds. "No thanks, sweetie. I'm just going to chill this morning. Maybe watch a bit of TV in bed and try to get my head together. Thanks for the offer. I'll come over later though, if that's okay." "Yes, of course, darling," Tilly replied. "I'll get Ray to whip us up some lunch later. Maybe sit in the garden and listen to some tunes." Maisie said goodbye and quickly hung up, after wishing them a nice breakfast. Tilly looked over at Ray, concerned. "I think there might be something wrong with Maisie. She seemed a bit off." Ray dismissed it, saying she's probably just hungover. Maisie got dressed in some baggy tracksuit bottoms and a vest top, and then dried her hair, which always took a while because it was so long and thick. She started daydreaming to the sound of her whirring hairdryer. She couldn't stop thinking about the weirdo at the cemetery. As she brushed her hair, she tugged a knot, causing a sharp jolt of pain, snapping her out of her pensive trance. With a huff, she put the hairdryer away and got herself a bottle of cold water from the fridge. She felt quite dehydrated. Her head was still throbbing. She got the crumpled note out of her purse to take another look. She stared at the crest stamped on it, wondering what it meant. She studied the crest intensely. It was mostly red, with what looked like feathers with a crown at the top. And the letter D was initialed in the middle. Maisie gasped. D is for Dracula, she said to herself. Dracula the vampire. Her eyes widened. She was now scaring herself. She went to get her laptop and fired it up, searching for vampire crests online. To her amazement, there were many of them. She was skeptical. She couldn't believe it. As she scrolled down the list, something caught her eye. There it was, the very same crest. Without a moment's hesitation, she took a photo of it on her phone. She delved more deeply into it, and lo and behold, it was said to be an ancient crest for the Count himself, Count Dracula. Legend suggested that Dracula was actually Vlad the Impaler, who had an unusual lust for blood. But there were tales and urban legends of creatures who grew fangs and drank blood to keep themselves alive, otherwise known as the living dead. Holy hell, Maisie said to herself. Did I really meet a real blood-drinking vampire? I need to tell Tilly. Too scared to delve any further, she shut the laptop with a loud clunk. She tried to rationalise the facts. How would an undead vampire have a mobile phone? She told herself to get real, and then dared herself to call the number. She picked up her phone and started to dial the number, but hesitated on pressing the last digit. With fear beginning to course through her body, she finally did it. It rang 3 times before a voice at the other end answered. It was him. My dear, I knew you would call. Maisie remained silent, wondering if he would know that it was her. Surely if he was a crazy person, he would have given this note to lots of people. However, before long, she couldn't stop herself from saying hello. She was trembling, and it came over in her voice. The voice on the other end replied, Don't be afraid, my flame-haired beauty. Maisie gasped. He knew it was her. With that, she hung up and threw the phone on the couch. Oh God, what have I done? She cried. She stared at the phone and then realised that he would now have her number. She scrambled to pick the phone back up and turned it off. Her heart was pounding and she felt a surge of blood rushing to her face. Her mouth began to get even drier than it already was. She reached for her water, took a mouthful, and tried to compose herself. She sat down on the couch, hugged her oversized white furry cushion to her chest, and buried her face in it. She was mad at herself for calling the stranger's number. Thinking what to do next, she picked up the remote control and switched on the TV in an attempt to take her mind off the subject. Daytime TV brought forth a quiz show, her favourite, but even that didn't work. Her mind was racing as fast as her heartbeat. She got up and went to her bedroom to change. I'll go to Tilly's, that'll make me feel better, she thought. She stuffed her phone into her handbag, still switched off. She locked her front door and headed to the bus stop. The bus was coming along as she neared her stop, so she picked up speed and put her hand out to stop the bus. The journey only took about 10 minutes, but Maisie was daydreaming and nearly missed her stop. She stood up and pressed the bell repeatedly to alert the driver to stop. "Hey," the driver exclaimed, "I heard you the first time." Maisie apologised as she got off the bus and walked briskly in a bid to clear her head. When she arrived, she knocked on the door and Tilly answered. As the door opened, the smell of cooking filled the air. Ray was cooking up something nice for lunch. Maisie complimented the lovely smell as she hugged Tilly and headed to the kitchen. "We were trying to call you," Ray said, as he offered her a spoon of the sauce he was cooking. Maisie gently sipped the sauce from the spoon, saying that her phone was switched off. "Why's that?" shrugged Tilly. "It could have been an emergency." Much to Tilly's dismay, Maisie started crying. The two of them hugged until he asked what was wrong. Maisie blurted it out in a haze of tears. "I've been so stupid. I called the weird guy's number. I got the paper out of the bin." "So silly. All these tears over that," Tilly laughed. "Is that why your phone's off?" Maisie dried her eyes on some kitchen towel and sipped her coffee. "Thanks, guys. I've been in a right state this morning." "Did he answer? Tell us what he said," Ray said as he sat down beside Maisie. "He knew it was me," she exclaimed. "He called me his flame-haired beauty." Ray reassured Maisie. "Don't worry, Princess. Turn your phone back on, and if he calls, I'll answer." Lunch was almost ready. Spaghetti with a side of garlic bread. "Make sure to eat your garlic bread, Maisie," Ray quipped. "It keeps the vampires away." "Okay, that's not funny, Ray," Tilly said. "You can see she's scared." But Maisie laughed, which broke the tension. They all settled down to eat. As they were all still a bit hungover, they settled down to watch a movie. Maisie dozed off halfway through, but Tilly didn't wake her because she thought she needed some rest. When the movie was nearing an end, Maisie woke with a start. She excused herself, saying that she had to get home. She had an early start for work tomorrow. As the sun was beginning to set, her friends accompanied her to the bus stop, seeing her onto the bus. Maisie looked at her phone. Thank God, she thought. No more calls from Mr. Crazy. She absent-mindedly browsed through her social media, and before long, it was her stop. The streetlights were now lit, casting an orange glow. Maisie looked up. It was a cloudy night, no sign of any stars. As she headed towards home, she fumbled in her bag for her keys and held them in her hand, ready to open her front door. She was just a few feet from her door when she noticed a black cat writhing playfully around on the pavement. Bending down to pet it, she brushed the cat's silky fur. It rubbed its face on her hand and purred loudly. So cute, she said to herself as she stood up. As her back straightened, she saw a familiar, terrifying sight in the alcove of her front entrance. Standing there was the same cloaked man that she saw at the cemetery. Immense fear engulfed her, and the blood drained from her face entirely. She tried to scream, but her breath caught in her throat, and her legs turned to jelly. He lunged at her as she turned to run, and grabbed her arm, She struggled and tried to get away, but he turned her face towards him and stared into her eyes. Suddenly, the fear that she'd felt melted away, and she was mesmerized by his gaze. She didn't feel any need to run anymore. She was completely helpless. Maisie stood frozen, her breath shallow, as the cloaked man's icy grip tightened around her arm. His eyes, deep and ancient, bore into hers, pulling her into a trance from which she couldn't escape. The world around her blurred, and it was as if everything else faded into nothingness, leaving only the two of them, suspended in the eerie twilight. "You've always been mine, Maisie," he whispered, his voice soft yet commanding, like velvet wrapped in iron. His cold fingers gently brushed the side of her face, and a strange warmth began to spread through her veins. "You were born for this." Maisie's heart raced, yet her mind, once flooded with fear, now felt at peace. It was as though a long-buried part of her was finally awakening. The world she'd known, with its mundane routines and fleeting pleasures, suddenly seemed insignificant. Her thoughts drifted to Tilly and Ray, to the happy, carefree moments they shared just hours ago. But even they, with their laughter and love, felt like shadows compared to the man who stood before her now. "I won't hurt you," he murmured, his lips dangerously close to her neck. "I will free you." Her eyelids fluttered as she fought to hold on to the last threads of her humanity. But deep down, she knew it was a losing battle. The stranger's presence was too overpowering, too intoxicating, and with each passing second, she felt herself slipping deeper into the darkness he offered. A sharp pain pierced the side of her neck, but it was fleeting, almost gentle. The sensation of his fangs sinking into her skin was unlike anything she'd ever imagined. Instead of agony, there was a surge of pleasure, of euphoria. Her entire body tingled as if electrified, and in that moment, she understood what he'd meant. She wasn't being destroyed. She was being remade. Time seemed to stretch into infinity. The stars above, once hidden by clouds, now glittered brighter than ever, casting their light upon the two of them, locked in this ancient, eternal embrace. Maisie's heart slowed, then stopped altogether, replaced by a new kind of pulse, a dark, thrilling energy that coursed through her. The man withdrew, his lips stained with her blood. His eyes, once cold and distant, now glowed with something she'd never seen before. Satisfaction, yes, but also affection, perhaps even love. Maisie, no longer trembling, no longer afraid, touched the side of her neck. Her fingers grazed over the fresh bite marks, now barely visible on her pale skin. She looked at him, and in that instant, she understood. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked through the cemetery gates with her friends yesterday. She'd been chosen, transformed, reborn into something far greater. "You're mine now," he he said softly, offering her his hand. Maisie hesitated for only a moment before slipping her fingers into his. The night air felt different against her skin now, sharper, more alive. She could hear the distant heartbeats of strangers walking the streets, smell the lingering scent of blood carried on the breeze. "I know," she whispered, a slow smile curling on her lips. "And I am yours." Together, they vanished into the shadows, leaving behind the world that Maisie once knew. A world that would never know what she'd become. But Tilly and Ray, they would soon discover it.